I would oftentimes have to, by 3, 4 hours in, close the door, turn the lights off, and sleep in my classroom with the lights turned off and hope that no one came to the door, because I just couldn't go one more minute teaching, looking at a computer, looking at print. My brain was just hurting. And I'd set an alarm, and about 25 minutes later, the alarm would go back off, and I would wake up and I would get a cup of tea and I would go about the rest of my day.
This is the Recovery After Stroke podcast with Bill Gassiamis, helping you navigate recovery after stroke.
Hello and welcome to Recovery After Stroke, a podcast full of answers, advice, and practical tools for stroke survivors to help you take back your life after a stroke and build a stronger future. I'm your host, three-time stroke survivor, Bill Gassiamis. After my own life was turned upside down and I went from being an active father to being stuck in hospital, I knew if I wanted to get back to the life I loved before, my recovery was my responsibility. After years of researching and discovering, I learned how to heal my brain and rebuild a healthier and happier life than I ever dreamed possible. And now I've made it my mission to empower other stroke survivors like you to recover faster, achieve your goals, and take back the freedom you deserve. If you enjoy this episode and want more resources, accessible training, and hands-on support, check out my Recovery After Stroke membership community, created especially for stroke survivors and caregivers. This is your clear pathway to transform your symptoms, reduce your anxiety, and navigate your journey to recovery with confidence. Head to recoveryafterstroke.com to find out more after this podcast. But for now, let's dive into today's episode. This is episode 156, and my guest today is vision and reading therapist Candice Vogel. Somewhat ironically, the stroke that Candice experienced caused her the same kind of vision problems that she had been working a lifetime to help others overcome. Candice Vogel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for reaching out and being willing to share your story. I know that it's taken you some time to get ready to be able to share your story more publicly.
Yes.
And I think it's a big step in recovery because it does help to get things off your chest and put it out into the universe and see what comes back. Before we talk about your journey from here on, tell me a little bit about what happened to you.
So it was a Sunday on January 12th, 2020. I was with my husband at my parents' home. We were meeting with a contractor. They had had some water damage. Prior that weekend, we had done a lot of trying to get water out of the home, and it looking back, it was a stressful situation, but I certainly didn't expect a stroke to come out of it. It was early in the morning, about 10 a.m., and as I was listening to the contractor speak and looking back and forth from my husband to my parents, and the reaction and taking in the information, I noticed what I thought was just the sun in my eyes or my hair in my eyes, and kind of brushed it aside. And as I looked closely at my husband from across the room, I noticed that there was a very sudden loss of the vision in what I thought was just my right eye. He describes the look on my face as sheer panic, and he and I left the room and went to the laundry room in my parents' home. And I was, this close to him. And as I looked at his face, to me, in my right, what I thought was just my right eye, the left side of his face was completely gone, as if there had been a line drawn from the top of his head right down, completely the center of his face. It wasn't dark or black. My husband had actually had a torn retina years a few years prior, and we were concerned that it was something like that. And he kept asking me, "What does it look like?" And it was just completely blurred out. I describe it as white, like looking through an opaque shower curtain almost. And it was gone. And I was extremely frightened, but truly believed that it was uh, an ocular event, something that was, wrong with my eyes, not a neurological event.
Uh,
Um,
Is
it
that the
it was
is that
Go
the
ahead.
only symptom that you had?
Yes, it was the only symptom. So when I think about signs of stroke and the FAST acronym, I had no facial paralysis. I had no paralysis, no facial drooping, no problems with my speech and language, nothing cognitively. It was just this sudden loss of vision or this blurred vision. It was a Sunday. I called my optometrist, and in December, the month prior, I had had an episode which they called an optical migraine, where there's almost like an aura, or you're looking through a kaleidoscope. Um, and that was almost exactly a month prior. The doctors say now that they really don't think that it had anything to do with my stroke. But um, when I called the doctor on Sunday, he said, "I really believe it's another optical migraine. I want you to lie down, rest, um, you know, take it easy," which was great advice. And so that's what I tried to do. Again, I was at my parents' home, not in my own home, but it was a home that I grew up in, and uh, carefully made it to my bedroom. At that point, I started to get a headache and felt nauseous, but again, very much like migraine symptoms. Um, kind of tried to sleep throughout while my husband was finishing up with my parents. As soon as he could, he came to get me, and we just decided to drive home. Our home is located about 10 miles from my parents' house, and the drive itself was the worst thing I've encountered in a very long time.
In
The
what way?
movement of the car, the speed, even though my husband wasn't speeding, just the feeling that I had as if I were on a roller coaster and I were upside down. Um, Again, continued to feel so nauseous. My head was pounding. Got home, and I really was unable to walk into my home um, upright. I kind of hid behind my husband. My children were sitting on the sofa and were concerned, but I really felt like this is the worst migraine I've ever had. I need to get to my bed. We need to close the blinds, and I need to sleep. Still no other symptoms of stroke at all. And I, at that point, didn't know that the vision that I was experiencing, or that was related to stroke either.
Yeah.
Um,
How could you? I mean, you've never met anybody who's had a stroke, probably. And if they did, they didn't have a vision issue with it, maybe, and they were probably
no,
older. And all the things
absolutely.
that we associate stroke to wouldn't be you. And how old were you at the time?
53. I was training for a half marathon with my daughter. People would describe me as very health conscious. I'm very aware of my body, and really felt like at that point in my life, I would have known if something, traumatic was happening, and I didn't. And honestly, looking back at that time, there are times when I struggle with the feeling of I should have known. I should have known that this wasn't right. I should have gone to the hospital, and and I didn't. I treated it as if it were a migraine. And honestly, trying to, my family was uh, helping me with, ice pack on the front of my head, heating pack on the back of my head. And I really feel like the amount of time I took to sleep um, help kind of because my eyes were closed, I didn't even realize I was still suffering with the vision issues. Sleeping was a way to escape from the pain, and from the, I wasn't aware of the loss of vision, or that it wasn't coming back. Um, so I kind of just hold up like you would with the migraine,
Mm.
and stayed in bed for most of the day. And about this 5 hour mark, I woke and actually felt like I could get out of bed, like I was hungry. Um, my son made me a grilled cheese sandwich. I came into the living room. The other big concern for me at that point in time was the light sensitivity and the sound sensitivity. My husband and my son were watching television. It was much too loud for me. Um, Visually, I asked for the lights to be turned off. Um, but again, looking back, that presented as a migraine to me. Um, so I went to bed that night. I'm a school teacher. I've been a teacher for 30 years, and ironically, I am a reading specialist. So I help children who struggle with reading and the visual processing skills that they struggle with. So the next day was a Monday, and of course, I had to go to school. Um, and said to my husband, I know I can't drive, but you have to take me to school. I greet children as they arrive. I walk children to their classroom. It's Monday morning. I have to be there. So chose not to put myself first.
If you've had a stroke and you're in recovery, you'll know what a scary and confusing time it can be. You're likely to have a lot of questions going through your mind. Like, how long will it take to recover? Will I actually recover? What things should I avoid in case I make matters worse? Doctors will explain things, but obviously you've never had a stroke before. You probably don't know what questions to ask. If this is you, you may be missing out on doing things that could help speed up your recovery. If you're finding yourself in that situation, stop worrying and head to recoveryafterstroke.com, where you can download a guide that will help you. It's called 7 Questions to Ask Your Doctor About Your Stroke. These 7 questions are the ones Bill wished he'd asked when he was recovering from a stroke. They'll not only help you better understand your condition, they'll help you take a more active role in your recovery. Head to the website now, recoveryafterstroke.com, and download the guide. It's free.
I showered and got dressed and tried to look in the mirror at my face and get ready, and went to my husband and my daughter and said, do I look okay? You know, my vision's kind of coming back, but I still had these deficits. And he drove me to school. And as I walked about and did my daily um, activity, as I did every single morning in um, smiling and getting children in and out of cars and greeting them, I just kept saying, I feel off. I just feel off. I still had a headache. My vision was still not good. And would notice some balance issues and just felt off. So uh, after I, after about 5-10 minutes, I said, we've got to go to the eye doctor. When he had said, come in at any time, you don't need an appointment, come right to my office. And so that's what we did. And honestly, that is the point where I really started to feel concerned that something was wrong. But that was the 24-hour mark, basically, about almost 24 hours to that point. Um, Arrived, and he was wonderful, and he ruled out a torn retina, any kind of optical issue, and he said, I really want to do some further testing with you. And he did it's a visual test of your peripheral vision.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, you look at the screen and you click a button every time you see a white flash of light. It's a very long test, and it proved that I had no peripheral vision left at all. It was completely gone. And when he showed us the results, he said, I just need to let you know that this is not an ocular issue. Your vision, your eyes, I had 20/20 vision at that point, and maybe needed a reader, a cheater, to read printed information. But he said, this is a neurological event that has already happened, and you need to go to the emergency room immediately. Do you know a good neurologist? And I didn't know a good neurologist. Um,
Who does?
and, and at that point, I really still never thought stroke. Immediately thought it's either an aneurysm or it's a tumor that's pushing on an optic nerve or something like that. That's where my head went. And again, I to back up, I my mother-in-law had a stroke in 2015, and so again, she was in her 80s, presented itself with physical issues, some speech and some cognition. My grandfather, in his 80s had a stroke, but like you said, other than that, I just didn't think that at 53 that I would go into the emergency room and be diagnosed with a stroke. So that still never came to mind when we were on our way to the hospital.
And fair
Uh,
enough. I mean, it's very fair enough. Would it make you feel better if I told you that I had numbness on my left side for 7 days, and instead of going to an eye doctor, um, I went to a chiropractor because I assumed that the numbness on my left side was as a result of my spine because of the
sure.
kind of work that I did, and because of the way that I was always at the chiropractor, never really paid attention to his advice of be careful lifting this and stretch and do this and do that. I never paid attention to him. So I was just going there to get him to fix my problems with my back and what I used to do. So I just assumed the same thing. It was a chiropractic issue. The first test, he said, look, it's not really obvious where the stuff is coming from, the numbness is coming from. It was 4 days after I first noticed the numbness. And then uh, I made another appointment to see him on the 8th day after I noticed the numbness. And he said to me, whatever's happening to you is not related to your back. He didn't say it's neurological, but he said, you need to go to the hospital to get them to check it out. And I said to him, I've got to work tomorrow. Like, I can't go to the hospital.
Right.
I've got a really important, massive, big day at work, and there's no way I can miss it. I went home, and then my wife said, what did the chiropractor say? I told her, he said I should go to the hospital. And she said, why didn't you go to the hospital? I said, well, because I got to work tomorrow.
I
And
know.
then she said, look, I'll take you to the hospital. They'll tell you there's nothing wrong. And then you'll go to work tomorrow and everything will be fine. I agreed with her. That sounded like a great idea. And of course, when I got there, they found a bleed on the brain and there was something seriously wrong. But like you, I couldn't have imagined in the world that there was a neurological issue, A, in my head, and B, I'd never met any single person that had a neurological issue that was my age, younger, or even older. I'd never, ever
Right.
met anybody. So I had no reference point to go, it's similar to what that other guy said or what that other gal said. I never had some way to create a story that perhaps this was more serious than I thought. So I did that. And then even 6 weeks later, when now I knew I was unwell, I had another bleed and I avoided going to the hospital again because I was at work against doctor's orders and I needed to finish this particular job before I made somebody drive me to the hospital. And that took 4 hours the second time to get to the hospital. And when I got to the hospital, I didn't know my own name. I couldn't recognize my wife. It was really serious, right?
Severe. Right.
So it doesn't that and this what we're discussing is not uncommon in lots and lots and lots of stroke survivors, especially the ones that don't get the symptoms that are associated to the fast message. Because even if
Right.
they've heard the fast message, they do what you do. They look for the closest similar person that they knew that had a neurological or that had an issue that sounded like theirs. And
Right.
like you did, you went straight to your husband's ocular issue with
Yeah.
his nerve.
Right.
And
His
it's like,
torn retina. Yep.
yeah. And migraines are such a massive thing in the world. They're very, very common. And it presents like every other migraine you've ever had.
Yeah.
You are fair enough to assume that it's a migraine. The thing about it is like, how can you have such a amount of data to go back to and reference, and then also to make matters worse, you put other people first. It's the other thing that we do. It's what you said. It's like, well, the children
That's what
need
I've
me.
always done. That's what I've always done. I am an
Yeah,
expert at putting everyone else first and myself at the very bottom. I've done it, for a very, very long time. So, um, yeah, that, and so looking back on things, of
yeah,
course, being at a point now, a year and a half out, and reflecting that I need to be able to release myself and give myself a little bit of grace for not. It seems so stupid now to not have known that something was severely traumatic, and that I should have addressed it in a different way. But again, I had no point of reference, and I do know now that I've recently in my education through this journey, have heard that they've added B fast, B
mm,
for balance, and E for eyes.
yeah,
But that's very, very recent, and I don't even know that people know enough about the FAST acronym on its own,
no,
in relation to stroke, but especially with this new, oh, let's add the BE so that people will know that. I do appreciate it now, but um, so I live in a small rural community, and we were about 40 minutes from the hospital. My sister in law worked at the hospital that we decided to go to, and so she went ahead and um, logged me in so that they knew that I was coming in the ER, which made my the travel there, knowing that they were going to receive me and get me in quickly, which is exactly what they did. And My hospital is in St. Louis, Missouri, and um, so upon arrival, they got me right into the emergency room and immediately did a CAT scan. Um I was really suffering from a pretty significant headache at that point. Um, but they did the CAT scan and said, we'll just kind of see what happens. And if it warrants an MRI, that'll be the next step. And so, of course, it warranted an MRI. And when he came back, he did say to the three of us, myself and my husband and my sister in law, that it appears that it was a stroke. And I just, again, couldn't comprehend that that's what they had found. And then he said, "You're going to have an MRI." And I've had MRIs in the past, and I was more nervous and scared and apprehensive about having to have an MRI in the head and neck because you have to be in that little cage, than I was about just hearing that I had a stroke. And I started to cry, and he said, "Oh my gosh, what is wrong?" And I said, I'm just really bad at an MRI. I'm really worried about the MRI. And of course, knowing also that I was internally afraid of what the results were going to be and everything that he had just told me. But he had to give me something to take so that I could, because it was an hour and a half long MRI with contrast and everything, head and neck to check everything. But um, and so I had that, and it was an ischemic stroke. So there was a clot that formed, and it occurred in the occipital lobe of the brain. I had never heard of the occipital lobe of the brain, and um, in my education and research through this journey, I've learned a lot about the occipital lobe. And many people think that it is just related to like color and shape, but honestly, the occipital lobe, it's located at the base of the brain. It's very large, and it is responsible for all of the visual information that we take in. Um, all forms of visual information. So,
it says on Google, it says the occipital lobe sits at the back of the head
yep,
and are responsible for visual perception, including color, form, and motion. Damage to
yep,
the occipital lobe can include inability to recognize the movement of an object, difficulties with reading and writing. Does that sound like you?
yeah, and it's everything. So for me, it's visual processing, um, visual perception, visual memory, figure ground, depth perception, distance, um, and primarily, again, being unable to read. I was completely unable to read, and I had no peripheral vision. So it's as if you have blinders on, and if someone were standing next to me, I could feel them and sense them, but I could not see them. Um, Part of my once I returned home from the hospital, part of my husband, he would hold up, okay, how many fingers am I holding up? Just off to the side, completely gone, gone. You know, can't see any of
Yeah.
that. So I was in the hospital for 3 days. I had every test that they could possibly give, vials and vials, and pints and pints of blood to draw, every heart and cardiac test that they could give me, the bubble test, the echocardiogram, an endoscopic echocardiogram to look at the heart from the top, through my throat and on top. Um, every single test was negative. Every test was negative. So my stroke is cryptogenic. And after 3 days and all the MRIs and all of the cardiac testing and all of the blood, even to test for something like an autoimmune disease or a clotting disorder, I went in and did not have high cholesterol, did not have high blood pressure, had no risk factors of stroke. After the 3-day mark, the doctor came in and said, unfortunately, it's cryptogenic and we'll probably never know why you had it, which is frightening. Um, it's frightening to have a stroke anyway, but
Mm.
for me, if they would have said it was your blood pressure, that's something that I could control.
You could address it.
I could address it and easily address it, but to continue to hear, we have no idea why it happened. And then at the same time, say, okay, you've been released. There's nothing more we can do for you. Good luck, basically. I passed every physical therapy assessment that they could give, every occupational therapy assessment, speech and language, cognitive evaluation, everything. And as thrilled as the therapists were to say, "Oh my gosh, you're great," I was still left with these huge visual deficits. Um, the evening that I was admitted, my husband left the hospital, and my sister-in-law stayed with me. And my husband left the hospital to go and get some things, personal items for my stay, and of course, had to tell my children and my parents, which was very frightening for him because, of course, I had just been admitted. It was all we knew at that point was I'd had a stroke.
How
And
old were the
again,
children?
explaining my children are 20. My daughter Alex is 24, and my son was 18 at the time, a senior in high school. My daughter was in college. Um, and then to tell my parents, who are in their 70s and 80s, that their daughter is in the hospital and has had a stroke, and share with my brothers and friends. And it was, just bizarre to
W-
share that
We tried
information.
to
But
lie. We tried to lie to
yeah,
my parents about that. I told my wife. So I was admitted to hospital late on a Friday evening, and I even lied to my wife because they did the CT scan. They revealed the blood clot, and because it was about 11 p.m. when they got back to me with the news, and I had sent her home to be with the children, who were at the time um, were 14 and 11. Um, I said to Christine, I said, look, they haven't done a scan yet, and they're too busy, so they're going to do it tomorrow morning, and they just want me to wait until the morning. So do me a favor, when you wake up in the morning, drop off the kids at mum and dad's, but don't tell them where I am. Just tell them that you need the kids looked after, and then come to see me at the hospital. And then she came to the hospital, and that's when I said to her, look, I wasn't honest. I didn't tell you last night because I wanted you to sleep or something like that. And in fact, they found a issue on my brain, and you need to we need to do another scan and an MRI and work out what it is. But of course, by then, she wasn't able to really properly be dishonest to my parents. They could tell
Right.
that she was not telling the truth.
Or
So
something, yeah.
we kind of let the cat out of the bag. But that was a really hard conversation to have with
It's very hard.
anybody.
Yes. And and of course I didn't have to have the conversation, my husband did. But and then my children came, he brought them to the hospital. Um, and of course I was still having tests done and they were doing a bubble test and I was so sick from the pain medication that they were giving me for my headache. My husband stayed with me the entire time, the 3 days that we were in the hospital, and my children came to visit when they could. But again, after the 3 days, it was determined that it was cryptogenic, and the social worker came and said, "Okay, we're going to release you to go home." They did put a heart monitor on my chest that I would wear for 6 weeks to monitor in case it was an undiagnosed AFib. Um,
Atrial
and
fibrillation,
while yes, yes, which I have
or
never had any issues.
maybe
Uh,
did they also try to rule out the hole in the heart, the PFO, the
that's what the yeah, and that's what the bubble test will do. They put a fluid or water, it's not water, saline
yeah.
into to see if it bubbles, and if it does, then but everything was clear. So I did go ahead and have the heart um, monitor, and I was to wear it for 6 weeks, and so I did leave the hospital with that. The other thing that we had to really fight for and advocate for was addressing my vision. I really feel like
Oh,
that my reading in particular, because it was as if I was just going to go home and that was going to be it.
mm.
As a reading specialist, which is my job, I oftentimes encourage parents to take their children for vision therapy, and we had to advocate for that for me now.
Oh, so you left with the same symptoms and there was no addressing of them.
Nothing, nothing. And so we asked for a prescription for vision therapy before I leave the house, just like you would for PT or and honestly, they would prescribe that. If I had left side paralysis, they
Yeah.
would prescribe, you're going to do physical therapy, you're going to do occupational therapy, you're going to do speech language,
Yes.
cognitive therapy, even cardiac therapy. If you have a heart attack, you get therapy for cardiovascular therapy. I left with nothing unless you know because we asked for it, and they're like, well, we don't even know of vision therapists in our area. And of course I did, because I recommend parents take their struggling readers. So
Wow.
there are 3 centers in our area, and I don't want to say reluctantly, but we were pushing for it. My husband had done tons of research in the 3 days that we were at the hospital and said that that was my best course for recovery, was to get vision therapy. It's neuro vision.
Of course it is.
So again, I try to explain to people, this is not an ocular issue. This is a neurological issue. It is how my brain perceives visual information and makes sense of that. And that's really difficult for people to understand. Really
I
difficult.
mean, they have the CT scan, they have an MRI scan that proves there's
It's
something happened in your
everything
head.
neurologically. It has nothing to do with my eyes. It is how the brain interprets all, and
Vision.
80% of what we take in
Mm,
is visual information
mm,
on a
mm.
regular basis. 80% of what we take in regularly is visual information, and my brain could not make sense of visual information.
I think this is
Uh,
going to be a really important part of this interview because that is one thing that people get stuck with. They leave hospital, they go home, and then there's that massive gap of, okay, what do I do now? And I have, I was one of those people. I even missed out on the opportunity to have neuropsychological assessment when I left. I had massive cognitive issues after the second bleed. I mean, it started off with not knowing my own name and not knowing who my wife
sure,
was, and then I couldn't type an email. I couldn't drive. I couldn't finish a sentence.
right.
Um, I couldn't remember who came to visit me. That was like that for about 9 months, 10 months, and nobody suggested, "Hey, what?
Cognitive therapy.
Yeah, you need to
Yeah,
have a baseline of where you're at,
exactly.
and then you need to know how the recovery is going in the future. You need to be able to look back and determine how far you've come." And
Right.
I had
And
to
that's
go,
hard to see when you're going through it.
"Yeah, how do
It
you
it
possibly know?
it's
You really."
hard to
Yeah,
it is hard to do that. So we left the hospital, um, being true advocates for myself as the
yourself,
patient,
yeah.
and that is something that I am very passionate about, is I've always been an advocate for children, and now I feel that I need to be an advocate not only for myself, but, others who suffer with stroke or whatever, health crisis they may encounter, um,
Yeah.
because it was what was best for my recovery. It was the only way, and I am such a firm believer in my I ended up, going to 2 different locations for assessments, visual assessments, neurological, vision assessments, and ended up, with a woman who, designed so she did my initial assessment and to see where my strengths and my weaknesses were, and it was so affected that percentile rankings go from 0 to 99 percentile, okay? So the 99th percentile is outstanding. And then age equivalencies. So for some of my visual perception and my skills, when they initially tested, um, my highest area was visual memory, and it was only at the 50th percentile. My lowest area was at the 5th percentile, and the
Mm.
age equivalent for that was 9 years of age. Um,
So you had a lot of ground to make up before you
oh
got
my
anywhere near being where you were at the start of the
It was
process.
and those numbers are what I deal with. I do a lot of testing on
Yeah.
children and visual issues, and so I couldn't read the report, obviously, because I couldn't read anything. I couldn't read a text message. I am a researcher and a questioner
Mm.
by nature, not only because I'm an educator, but that's just how I process information, and so I couldn't come home and research on the internet. I couldn't check out a library book. I couldn't go to the bookstore because
Ooh.
I could not read any visual information.
Wow.
I couldn't take in anything. And I have always known I was a visual learner, but especially after this process, because then I had to become an auditory learner.
Okay.
Um, and
So
that
I'm
that was difficult.
curious, right? How do you deal with that emotionally? Like, you're talking very clinically right now. There had to
I
have
know.
been an emotional aspect to this for you. Most stroke survivors say, that it was very difficult emotionally. And what most stroke survivors do is they focus on the physical recovery because that's the obvious
Right.
recovery, right? So you're
Yep.
also then going, I need to focus on my visual recovery because that's the part that is obviously missing. But
And it's
how does the emotional part of it play
and
out
s
in
I
your
think
stroke?
I I think that the emotional part the thing was it was so ironic. It was so ironic that I had this stroke and where it occurred and what my line of work is. And again, I'm always advocating for children who struggle with reading and not just that they don't like they haven't found a book that they like. Honestly, with many, many children, it is a processing issue. It's how their brain is processing, printed information. I have BD reversals now. It's as if you think about people who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. I transpose letters from the end of a word to the beginning of a word. I look at a line of print and it's gone. There are only 3 words on that line of print. I cannot track. I have to use tracking. I have to use all of these modifications. But emotionally, I think that I felt just like any other person who suffers a health crisis. Had complete and utter fear that it was going to happen again and that next time it would be debilitating or it would kill me. I had So that fear, the fear of the unknown, in the hospital, I told my husband, well, I'll go back to work. I'll go back to teaching, just even if it's half days, in about 4 weeks, just minimizing what had happened. And I think for me, minimizing it because it wasn't physical, it wasn't a speech language. I need to recover from this very quickly because this is not like when my mother in law had her stroke and she had to learn how to, to walk again and use her fine motor skills. And so I was telling myself, and I believe minimizing
Mm.
how the severity of it and comparing it to other types of strokes, and that probably perhaps mine was just not so bad. Um, but it fear and uncertainty and then the irony of it all. And then uh, you know, feeling that lack of that sense of being out of control because I
Mm.
couldn't figure out why it had happened.
Mm.
So I had no control. So for me, then it was, a huge change in my diet was already really good, but that's the direction I went because I could control my diet. I could
Yeah.
control going outside for physical movement. With my stroke, and I hear this on your podcast with people all the time, mine is very hidden. It's a very hidden disability. You can't see that I have left side paralysis. You can't see what's going on in my brain. So even a year and a half out, oh my gosh, 3 days after I got home from the hospital, people would come to visit. They're like, "Well, you look great and you sound great."
Yeah.
And they had no idea what was going on neurologically in my head.
Mm.
The headaches, the fullness, the ringing in my ears, all of the neurological symptoms that from a brain injury that we all experience. I struggled with all of that. And on
So,
top of it, I had the vision.
so right now, what are you left with? What do you still have?
So I am a year and a half out. I did vision therapy, even though again it wasn't covered. I had to fight and I had to write letters of appeal. My doctors wrote letters of appeal for me. Vision therapy is not covered. And again, my fight was, and I'm advocating for the fact that this is a neurological issue.
Mm.
If I needed PT, they'd write me a prescription if any of that. But they would not cover it. Insurance would not cover any vision therapy, not
So
even.
do you still have do you still have vision issues?
Oh, yes, yes. Now I've made huge progress, but I've made huge progress because of the work that I've done, and time. I think, uh, but I had so much. So I started therapy in January, about 2 weeks after my stroke, and I continued that for basically 8 months. I did vision therapy in my home 5 days a week, every single 5 days. I would work for roughly an hour on my own with the protocols that had been provided. And then I would go see my therapist 1 day a week for an hour. And every time that I thought, oh, I've got this, she would give me another activity and that would prove to be that much more difficult. And I would feel like, oh, I don't have this. Simple things like throwing a bean bag into a bucket or a basket that she held, being able to touch my nose and touch a dot on a poster board. My midline had shifted. We all have an imaginary midline, and my midline had shifted, so everything was off. I had no figure ground, so to the I Spy books that maybe your boys had, where it's all of those pictures, and you're supposed to find the shovel.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't do anything like that because visually I could not distinguish between all of those shapes. I did a lot of large print crossword puzzles, large print word searches, mazes that you would give a kindergartner, with a crayon or a marker, and I couldn't stay in the lines. And all of that was I had to do so much work. I couldn't drive, obviously, because of my visual deficits, but So now, a year and a half out, I am able to drive short distances. I don't drive at night. I don't like to drive in the rain. But I really thought that I would read and read well before I would drive. And that isn't the case. And it's because when you drive, you've got all of your vision to use. And when you read, it's just what is right in front of you.
So you're a
Um,
visual learner. You're
and my
the
brain,
the amount of your identity that is stuck around vision, I've obviously, because of the work that you do and then because of what happened to you, is pretty extreme. I've never come across anybody who will talk about vision to the extent that you can, and it's
yeah,
fascinating that you had to have that condition to you. I'm gonna chuck a woo-woo comment out there. Maybe the universe is telling you something about the next level of your learning, of your level of understanding of what it
right,
takes to perceive information. So if you're struggling reading, and that has been one of your biggest skills in teaching people how to read and overcome reading challenges, do you get a lot out of listening to books? Because I have always struggled to read. I've just never enjoyed it. I thought it was boring, especially when you're looking at
yeah,
black and white words,
right.
black words on a white page. Um, and I get a lot out of listening to books. What's that like for you?
So it's the exact opposite. I have had to really learn to train myself to be an auditory learner. I just recently listened to a podcast that you did, and you mentioned I can't think of her name, but the book was Stroke of Insight. No,
Jill Bolte Taylor.
yes, yes, yes. So, in when I came home from the hospital, all I wanted to do was soak up all the information I could about stroke. And again, I couldn't. Went to the bookstore with my husband, who was very dear and kind enough to say, "What about this?" And there's really not a lot of great books out there, honestly. And I didn't feel like it pertained to me and my individual story. But I we found that she had a book at our library which had 5 CDs that you could listen to. And so my husband checked out the book and I listened to the CDs. And that was my first education into what I was going to experience, had experienced, and the first person that I could connect with as far as her story goes. And I had to do that auditorily. And all I wanted to do, I would listen to it, but I just wanted to look at the book and follow along. And I couldn't do that. So turning to Audible, people were like, get Audible, get Audible. Um, I can listen to it. It's just not my mode of learning, but I am getting better. And again, in my email, I mentioned to you your podcast, being able to find your podcast and listen to people's stories was transformative for me.
Mm.
And the first time, and I really wanted to go back and be able to reference this young man. The first time I ever heard anyone on your podcast speak to a visual um, issue like I have, he was a young man, maybe in his 20s, and he was at work one day and he had this issue with his vision. And my husband and I were outside and I had to stop it. And I said, "Oh my gosh, there's someone on the podcast who has vision issues like me." And that was just everything for me. It truly was everything for me. Because as you
Why?
know, with
Why
it,
was that everything for you? How is somebody else
because
having vision problems good for you?
I know, and it's the same thing. So my hope is that my story and sharing this with you today will help somebody, whether it's a caregiver or someone
Yeah,
who's experienced it, because I was able to connect and identify. That's
yeah,
why that helped me. I was able to identify with someone else who had experienced something like me because I didn't know anyone. Every stroke story that I heard or read about, or I wasn't able to read it, but my husband was sharing with me, everyone's was, and they are all different. It doesn't matter neurologically if you've had a neurological event or not. All of our stories are different, but that having someone who had their vision affected, um, even though it sounds terrible to say, "Oh, I'm so glad that he had that stroke and it occurred there and affected his vision," that resonated with me and helped me. So if
Yeah.
I
You're
can
not
in turn,
saying you're not saying you're glad you found it because you're glad they had a stroke. You would prefer not to have ever found a stroke podcast. You would prefer never have anything in common with people who have had a stroke, and you
right,
prefer nobody ever had a stroke. So I
right,
totally get that, because it was the podcast that made me feel uh, okay, normal. I don't know what the word is, but I started it because I didn't know enough people that had overcome what I was going through, or had been through what I through, and no one understood me. So now I
mhm,
have more than 150 people who understand me, that I've spoken to directly. So it is some kind of a relief that I'm not alone, and
right.
I wish we were. None of us were in this group.
Right. And I hear you say that, and it is so. When I came home and people in my family had to go back to their reality, I felt so isolated and so alone. And again, I couldn't even watch television to distract myself. I couldn't get on the internet. I couldn't research and Google. I was supposed to be resting and sleeping, and I know that now, but I do believe that I pushed myself through so that I could feel some sense of normalcy. I couldn't drive. I couldn't, that independence is taken away, um, and at the same time, again, I still find that I minimize my stroke because I'm comparing it to other people, and I think, well, it's not as bad as. But then I'll hear someone who has a physical issue, and they say, "Oh my gosh, but at least I could read." I'd never be able to not read. So that's something that I chuckle about, and I think that that's interesting that all of our perspectives are so different. And
Any stroke is a bad one. Any stroke is
I
not
know,
a good thing, and that's unfortunately the way that we judge it. Lots of things in life is how it looks on the outside. There's very little reflection on what's going on the inside, and people don't know enough to ask the right questions about
right,
what's going on the
right.
inside. They don't know about neuroplasticity like we become so
Yep.
aware of, and we learn
I'm an
about.
expert about
Yeah,
neuroplasticity, and
right.
I am such a firm believer. And I was someone who every time I went to a neurologist appointment or a neurological ophthalmologist, and you speak to this all the time, is that timeline, that recovery timeline. And I'm against the idea of a recovery timeline. I feel very strongly about that. Are there times when I feel like I've hit a plateau? Um, yes, but then I also believe, okay, what can I do now to get maybe it's just a plateau. That doesn't mean that my recovery has stopped. I believe that I will continue to build new pathways and reconnect and heal my brain. Sometimes I think, oh my gosh, it's been a year and a half. And other times in the same breath, I can say, it's only been a year and a half.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the thing. When I'm coaching people to get through this, is I really try to get them to say, do not place a timeline on it. You're
Yeah,
sure to be disappointed with stroke, unfortunately. If you're basing your how far you've come on the date that you get there, that's going to be disappointing. Just don't do
yeah,
that if you can avoid it. And then the other thing I like to tell people is that, with neuroplasticity, you can adjust and overcome even deficits. Even if you're not walking correctly, it's still neuroplasticity that's helping you become more mobile or
right.
find a way around that inability. So
Yep.
even with your vision, if it doesn't get back to 2020 and have all the peripheral vision or whatever, it's neuroplasticity still finds a way to help you get along or get around with the way your vision works now, and the
Right.
brain adjusts, the body adjusts, and everything eventually adjusts. It's not to say that it's the same or perfect or back to normal, but
Right.
it adjusts and you make do. Now, I don't know whether that's comfort enough for some people, but like that's what sometimes we've got to hope for. We've got to hope for finding a way to overcome the deficit in a way that still gets an outcome which is
Yeah.
supportive.
So I do use a lot of modifications. And again, these are modifications that I would put into place with a struggling reader. I would suggest these things to teachers in a classroom. I would suggest these things to parents. I have to use magnifiers, line guides to help me go line by line. It's really important to me. I have to not get lost on a page. I have to practice a lot. But if I were just, I'm unable to say, just pick up a magazine and read it. I can't pick up a textbook and just read it. It takes me a lot of time on a computer. I have a very large font size. I have a colored cursor that is huge. I use a lot of text to speech because the amount of neurological fatigue that I feel in just reading 3 emails where I would have just knocked that out in my classroom on a regular basis, it takes forever. So modifications, highlighting text as it's read to me, have been vital for me getting back to the things that I was used to doing before.
I'm
Um,
curious. I'm curious, right? So, one of the reasons Jill Bolte Taylor is so special is because she's a medical person that's had a
yes,
stroke, and she's
yep,
applied her craft
I know.
to stroke recovery because it was ironic for her as well. She was
I
researching the
know.
brain because her brother was unwell, and she wanted
Yes.
to understand how to support people with neurological conditions like schizophrenia and that type of thing. So you sound like you're a, you're going to be a better um, vision therapist because
And
of
reading teacher.
your
Yeah.
experience. Does that
Right.
resonate? Is that right?
It does, and people say to me all the time, I can't believe that you are, so just to fast forward a little bit, I did after, I stayed home that my stroke happened in January and I stayed home through COVID, and secretively I say that, I was not thrilled with a pandemic and a shutdown. But for me, my family was home with me during my recovery, which just warmed my heart. And even though they were all doing their own things, whether it was schoolwork or our work, I could go outside in my garden or go tinker about, and we were all here. So that was during my recovery. I stayed home against everything in my being. I chose not to go back to school. And, and again, I've been teaching for 30 years. It's what I do. And I felt as if I was disappointing everyone. I was disappointing my principal, my administrators, the children, the parents. I was letting everyone down because I was not returning. And that decision to do so was a heart wrenching for me. Um, Initially, I thought, oh, I'll go back half days. It won't be a big deal. And I had to, again, put myself first. I would tell a friend to put themselves first. I would say, you've had a health crisis, all the things that you would tell a friend to do in a very meaningful way. But I would never tell myself to do that. But I did choose to stay home, and I did not go back for that school year. In August, once school rolled around again, even with COVID and going back, we were full in person. Um, I was bound and determined to at least try. I was eligible for retirement 2 years prior, and we talked about it and discussed it a lot. But I decided to go back to school. And a lot of people said, I don't know that that's a good idea. Maybe you're not thinking about your health. And all I had done was think about my health, but I at least had to try. So I went back. It was very difficult. I I would oftentimes have to, by 3, 4 hours in, close the door, turn the lights off, and
Mhm,
sleep in my
mhm,
classroom with the
mhm.
lights turned off and hope that no one came to the door because I just couldn't go one more minute. Um, Teaching, looking at a computer, looking at print. My brain was just hurting. Um, And I'd set an alarm, and about 25 minutes later, the alarm would go back off, and I would wake up and I would get a cup of tea and I would go about the rest of my day. And I do feel like I pushed myself, and there were times that I would come home and just the look on my face, I would just have to go sleep
I've
for
got
the.
I've got to say that I'm going to talk about that. You say you pushed yourself. That is really important. I know there's a time when you shouldn't be pushing yourself in stroke recovery, but then there comes a time where you have to push yourself and you have to break through the barriers that you have set for yourself, either
Yeah,
mentally or a
that
doctor has set for you emotionally, or you've got to get to those barriers and you've got to push them and you've got to see what happens when I
right.
do. Do I suffer? Do I suffer and then recover a little bit? Do I gain
Yep,
some ground? Do I have a setback? If you don't do that, you're never going to know. So
right.
there's a time
And so
for it.
yeah, and I'm glad to hear you say that because it validates, because there are many times when I second guess I second guess and I'm like, I pushed myself too hard. I had, my neurological ophthalmologist who did my vision therapy said, I do not want you to get to the point where you redline and you push, and then you have a complete setback
Mm,
because you pushed yourself too hard. But you're exactly right. I had to figure out on my own what was too much, and then step back. Some days I would go and have a great day at school, and I'd be able to come home and have dinner with my family, and other days I wouldn't be able to function. It came to a point then where I felt like for a long period of time, I was spending my weekend recovering to get
mhm,
ready to go back 5 full days and do it
mhm.
over again and then put myself in this cycle. So I started taking half days on Wednesdays just to break my week up a little bit, and that really helped me get through the remainder of my school year. In February, I did announce my retirement. I think prior to stroke, I would have gone maybe 2 more years, but really felt that it was time. And I also know that I went out um, of my career as an educator at the height of my career. I wasn't a teacher who someone said, "Oh my gosh, she really should have retired 5 years ago." I wasn't that person. But again, perspective, giving myself perspective. I had gone through this. I was finally putting myself first. I had come this far. I had done all of these, you know, um, remarkable things in my recovery. And so I did retire. And then uh, that was in May, was the end of my just past May, retired. And about 2 weeks later, I signed a contract to continue teaching part time at a different school. So now I am officially retired, but I call it this soft retirement. And yesterday, for the very first time, I presented um, in front of an audience of other teachers because I help teachers teach the best way to teach readers. Um, 20 new peers, colleagues of mine, and presented a full presentation on reading and what it will look like during the school year. And at the very end, I just ended it by saying on a personal note, and told a group of individuals that I had had a stroke, which was huge for me. And of course, immediately the audience is like, they're gasping, and no one knows. It's very hidden.
I'm going to give you a little bit of advice first, but before I do that, and not advice that this is not me preaching to you how you should go about your life, but something that I think would be amazing in those presentations. But before that, I want to go. So I want to ask you to reflect back on your time helping other people learn to read and overcome reading difficulties. Did you really, really deeply know how much of a struggle it was for them? Or did you have a good idea, and did this stroke condition really enhance your deep understanding of how they were suffering?
I felt like I did only because the training that I have received has in reading and helping a struggling reader has been centered on the brain and the processing. But was I and again, I've said it so many times, advocating for children and teaching others about children who struggle, um, was I really able to, I feel like I was able to recognize and, and help analyze information and diagnose reading difficulties with children. But to clearly feel what they were feeling with reversals and seeing words as they see words, no, not until I was, and I shared that with a child, which was also very enlightening. I was gone for a long time, and my students would say, "Where is she? And when is she coming back?" And I have one student who I had worked with. He was a third grader when I had my stroke, and he kept saying, "When is she coming back to school?" And a friend of mine said, "Well, she's having some difficulty with her eyes." And he said, "Well, why doesn't she just eat more carrots and come back to school?" But the following school year, he brought an assessment down to me that he had done to share with me. And he had done remarkably well on it. And he just wanted to share his success. And I said, I know how much you have struggled when I've worked with you. And I need to share something with you now. That issue that I had with my eyes, I now am a struggling reader just like you. And the look on his face was just priceless. Of course, he's a child. And I said, I know what you are going through when it's difficult. I know that you're not just giving up and you're not just avoiding the task. I understand because I'm unable to pick up a book and read it unless it is, large print or
Yeah.
I have to read it and reread it and read it again, because now as a reader, instead of just relying on my meaning, which I have meaning because, I've been a reader for a very long time, it is so visual because I'm trying to demystify the code of print and text. And I read and then I reread and then I reread again. And to hear me read aloud is painstaking because it is word by word. And that's all very, very new. So to share that with this group of individuals that I shared with yesterday, that's a new platform for me to really talk to people as a person who struggles with significant visual deficits in reading. So it is, again, ironic, a new perspective, and interesting. So my hope for the future is that I can continue to share that message. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Facebook. I can look at pictures on Instagram, but I can't read the captions. So even if I had an Instagram page, I talked to my daughter, or my son about getting an Instagram. I'm not able to navigate that world like others are. So I'm at a point where I'd like to share my story as I'm doing with you. I don't know how I will continue to do that. I've
You'll
never participated in a support group or
you'll find a
uh,
way. Now,
yeah.
that was
I hope
that was going to be my advice slash, you know, idea, me planting a seed in your head. It was basically what was going to be. And look, there are people that are completely blind that are using the social medias and the internet and all that kind of stuff. And therefore I feel like you'll be able to find a solution to overcome that. And you can do video presentations, just
right.
short snippets that you can
Yep.
get somebody else to post for you, and then they could read back the comments to you, and you could
Right.
respond to those comments in exactly the same way. So if you really wanted to do that, there's definitely a way to overcome it. And it's early, and I understand. So there's no timeline on this, but it's just me planting seeds. And the reason being is because my community wants to hear from people like you, because you have both perspectives. You have I used to help people in this area, and now I'm one of those people
And
that
now
needs
it's
help in
me.
this area.
Yeah.
That's very rare, and it's much needed. And your version of the way that you would tell the story would be completely different to a therapist who's never had a vision problem telling the story. And not to minimize what they do, because you are one of them, and that's amazing work, but it is a completely different story when the therapist is also experiencing the same problem. So from that little perspective, if I can do anything and encourage you to do anything, is at some point in time is find a way to share this gift that you have, which is both insights of both ends of the spectrum, and you're going to be able to make a massive difference in people's lives and enhance your purpose, uplift people, take your career to the next level, and become a real leader. Not that you already weren't, but become a real leader in this space. And it's bizarre and strange, but that's really where it's at. And I tell you because there's gifts in every stroke survivor's stroke. And one of the most amazing things that stroke survivors do, which I find bizarre, and I was one of them, is that they immediately want to help other people. And that's what we need.
Right. And that's been my profession. I'm in a helping profession. So I think it was just the time, and again, telling the story and hearing it, again, from that perspective of being a reading teacher, it is interesting. But you know, I just I Um, I just wasn't at that point yet, but I
Yeah.
do feel like I am now. It's interesting. 1 year after, on my anniversary, I had told myself, "Oh my goodness, it's coming up on a year. It's going to be a year," and I told myself to take the day off and take some time for myself. And January 12th came and I went to work like any other day and then realized in my classroom, oh my gosh, it's January 12th. And I was in tears and I called my husband and said I was going to take the day off. And I didn't even realize it was today. But in a way, I think that's a good thing that I that showed some um, again recovery and rehabilitation. I think mentally and emotionally that I wasn't so fixated on
Yeah.
the
Some
day
healing.
that I was some healing. That
Yeah.
yeah, it's a day to day. I'm a projector into the future, or I like to live in the past and mull over and overthink every decision that I made
Uh-huh.
and why there was no answer to why I had a stroke. So it must have been something I did myself, too much stress or something, because otherwise they would have found an answer. But I really am trying very, very hard, and it's so difficult to stay present and just live each day and do the things that I love to do and enjoy things that I can do. And um,
You'll get better
that's
at that. You'll get
I
better at
hope.
that. It does take time to relearn how to become yourself again and how to get out of the habits that you've had before. And we hear about we hear about the emotional challenges that stroke creates. So that can be a distraction from being present, because if stroke does anything, it brings to light all the stuff you have never dealt with in the past. So that's easy to distract you from the present, right? And then
Yeah.
you actually have physical proper deficits that brings you into the present, but it brings you into a not so nice present because I can't do this and I can't do that. So that takes it away. So then you might not have had a good night's sleep, so that
Oh,
interferes with your present and being able to stay present.
I really struggle with sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And then if you can't be physical and you can't do all these things, then that struggles with your present. You're looking for ways to distract yourself. But what does help to bring you to be present is doing a gratitude practice and practicing what you're grateful for today. Today's been a shit day, but I am grateful for these things. That lifts your mood, that changes your heart rate, that decreases the cortisol level in your
Yeah.
body. That actually starts training your brain to start focusing what's good about this, even though there's lots that aren't. But then you shift from being constantly focusing on stuff that's not supporting, and you actually go into stuff that is supporting, and you
Right.
start to see the light at the end of the tunnel of this emotional roller coaster that we go on. So gratitude on a daily basis supports that. And what is a gratitude practice? It's just, I do it at night before I put my head on the pillow or while my head's on the pillow. I'm grateful for the work that I did, the people that I met, my family, my friends, and whatever comes to mind that I'm grateful for, which are the true gifts in life. And
Right.
none of it is, I'm grateful for the opportunity to do more hours at work or win the or win the lotto or do any of that stuff. Like, it's all about just the simple things that come to us that are free, that really make life better
Yes.
if you focus on them. So,
Yeah, and for me, it was so again, you said like the physical, being able to go outside and just breathe in fresh air, or I couldn't go for a walk by myself because what looked like cracks on a sidewalk, just normal cracks to you, to me looked like it was elevated and dangerous to walk on. My husband would have to get down with his hand and go over the crack and say, okay, this is just a normal crack in the sidewalk. But to me, it was scary because I thought I was going to trip and fall. So to get to a point where I could walk on a regular basis,
yeah.
that I walked 4 miles every single day with my dog. That was so therapeutic. I listened to podcasts. I did things that brought me joy. The simplest things that I could find that would get me out of my head and
Mm,
really truly help with that recovery, because there's just so much to recovery. It's
yeah.
not just the vision. It's not just the physical.
Mm-mm.
Um, there's so much to the recovery process,
I
and
call
I'm
it
still
I call
recovering.
recovery I call recovery three-tiered, and in those tiers there's other levels, but in the top tiers there's the emotional recovery, there's the physical recovery, and then there's the psychological recovery.
Absolutely,
And if you're
I agree with
focusing
that.
on one only, you're missing out on the
Right?
other two, but you
Yes.
can't be just focusing on two and missing out on one. It's not a complete recovery. You've got to focus on all three. And
Yes.
this is what happens when I ask people about where they're missing out on. And obviously they're doing the physical stuff, they're recovering the stuff that's important, and that's why I asked you, well, that's obvious, and that's why I asked you about your emotional state early on in the piece, is because
Yeah.
I could tell the first thing that you focus on is what's missing, that's obvious, is my vision. If I get that back, things will be okay. But
Yeah.
w- what if you don't get it back, and then
Right.
what
Right.
what are you going to do then?
Exactly. And I still get overwhelmed. I still have many moments where I just cry,
Mm.
not because just because it's an overwhelming emotion. Um, and I was a crier before my stroke, uh, so I'm not just going to blame that on stroke, but it's still an
Of
emotional journey. Um,
course.
so and that's just something that I'll continue to to try to heal and feel. But I am a firm believer also that if I have those feelings, whatever those feelings are, if it's anger or sadness or happiness, to feel it in the moment, but not let it hinder me from moving forward. Again, a cryptogenic stroke, I could have been curled up in a ball and not wanting to leave my bed or leave my home because of fear, that crippling fear of what if it happens again, and I don't know why it happened. So I would have to make a list of things I can control and things I'm unable to control, and focus
On
on
what you
that.
can. Yeah, focus on what you
Yeah.
can control. That's it. That's the perfect antidote to anxiety and depression. And that's what mindfulness is. It's doing in the moment what I can do
Yep.
and doing that as best as I can, because that's a path to recovery as well. It's not about I can't do that and therefore I need to worry about
Yeah.
what I can't do. Just do what you can do, and then
Right.
other things might come in the future. They might just appear one day as being something that you've overcome that you didn't realize you were overcoming, because you were focusing on overcoming whatever it was, whichever deficit it is. This conversation for me is quite fascinating, um, and I'm really glad that you reached out and connected and made a point of talking about vision, because even though I've touched on vision, as you know, there's not a lot of people in my podcast who have been able to um, really share stories of vision. I could probably think of about 5 or 6 episodes where vision is an issue, and those people are challenged by it on a daily basis. So this one is going to really make a make it possible for a lot more for those people to relate to somebody else again, to relate to somebody else. Somebody from your background, I think, is even more special. So I know you're not on the social medias, but some people might want to choose to reach out to you.
Oh, absolutely. I would love that.
Is there a
Um,
way that we could get them to reach out to you?
yeah, if email is okay, my email address is Vogel, Vogel, Candice, Candice, the number 4 at gmail.com. Um, and I have all the modifications I need on my computer as far as my email is concerned. I'd be so happy to correspond and connect with people that way. And again, hopefully, as I continue my recovery and my journey, maybe one day I'll have an Instagram page or something like that. Again, if I feel like I'm finally at a point where I uh, enjoy feel as if my story is something I'd like to share. Again, even if it helps one person, just as that young gentleman did on the podcast that I mentioned before, it was as if just a light bulb. The emotion that I felt over hearing him say it affected my vision was just it just meant the world to me. And so and again, it's so validating just to hear about other people's stories, and even if they're not related to vision, and still the neurological aspect of it all helps connect.
Yeah.
So I'd be happy to correspond with anyone who wanted to reach out. And I can't thank you again enough for doing what you do, and having a platform in which to share stories, because I think those personal encounters can make all the difference in recovery. Um, so thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for saying so. And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Thanks so much for joining me on today's Recovery After Stroke podcast. Do you ever wish there was just one place you could go to for resources, advice, and support in your stroke recovery? Whether you've been navigating the journey on your own for weeks, months, or years, I know firsthand how difficult it can be to get the answers you need. This road is both physically and mentally challenging, from reclaiming your independence to getting back to work to rebuilding your confidence and more. Your symptoms do not follow a rule book, and as soon as you leave hospital, you no longer have medical professionals on tap. I know for me, it felt as if I was teaching myself a new language from scratch with no native speaker in sight. If this sounds like you, I'm here to tell you that you are not alone, and there is a better way to navigate your recovery and build a fulfilling life that you love. I've created an inclusive, supportive, and accessible membership community called Recovery After Stroke. This all-in-one support and resource program is designed to help take your health into your own hands. This is your guidebook through every step in your journey, from reducing fatigue to strengthening your brain health to overcoming anxiety and more. Now, to find out more and to join the community, just head to recoveryafterstroke.com. See you on the next episode.
Importantly, we present many podcasts designed to give you an insight and understanding into the experiences of other individuals. Opinions and treatment protocols discussed during any podcast are the individual's own experience, and we do not necessarily share the same opinion, nor do we recommend any treatment protocol discussed. All content on this website and any linked blog, podcast, or video material controlled this website or content is created and produced for informational purposes only and is largely based on the personal experience of Bill Gassiamis. The content is intended to complement your medical treatment and support healing. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied on as health advice. The information is general and may not be suitable for your personal injuries, circumstances, or health objectives. Do not use our content as a standalone resource to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease for therapeutic purposes or as a substitute for the advice of a health professional. Never delay seeking advice or disregard the advice of a medical professional, your doctor, or your rehabilitation information program based on our content. If you have any questions or concerns about your health or medical condition, please seek guidance from a doctor or other medical professional. If you are experiencing a health emergency or think you might be, call 000 if in Australia, or your local emergency number immediately for emergency assistance, or go to the nearest hospital emergency department. Medical information changes constantly. While we aim to provide current, quality information in our content, we do not provide any guarantees and assume no legal liability or responsibility for the accuracy, currency, or completeness of the content. If you choose to rely on any information within our content, you do so solely at your own risk. We are careful with links we provide. However, third-party links from our website are followed at your own risk, and we are not responsible for any information you find there.